This is a lecture over molecular shapes, and it is a rather complex topic, one that you'll want to be alert and probably taking some notes on. So first of all, you might wonder, why is the shape of a molecule so important? It turns out to be critically important in biological systems. A lot of the systems in your own body are activated and run by kind of a lock and key mechanism where a molecule of a particular shape fits together with another molecule and activates a whole system. That's how pharmaceutical companies tend to work when they're doing their research. There's usually, again, a particular shape of a molecule that's known to activate something in our bodies, and so the chemists will work to replicate that shape. From a kind of more boring chemical standpoint, the shape determines in large part the chemical reactivity of a molecule, and so that's important to chemists too. All right, what is it that determines the shape of a molecule? It's all to do with the valence electrons, okay? And the valence electrons, of course, since they have a charge, it's a negative charge, they repel one another. And so the bottom line is valence electrons will try to get as far away from each other as possible. And so the shape around any central atom is determined by the electrons around that central atom spacing themselves in a way that they're as far away from each other as possible. The acronym for that is VESPER, that's how you pronounce it, but that stands for valence shell electron pair repulsion theory. So the first thing you need to understand, I'm going to give you a procedure for determining the shape of a molecule, but you need to understand first of all what we mean by electron domain. An electron domain is any area of electron density around a central atom. So if A is our central atom, each area counts as one electron domain. So this double bond, this is important, this double bond counts as only one domain, okay? It's an area. Each of the single bonds, any bond at all, counts as one domain. And a lone pair of electrons counts as one domain. So this central atom A has 4 electron domains around it. That means 4 areas of high electron density. So just as a brief, you don't need to memorize this yet. I'm going to go through them one by one, but just to let you know what we're talking about. The gold ball represents the central atom in all of these drawings, and it shows you the geometry that a molecule would adopt if the central atom had 2 electron domains. Okay, that would be linear. If a central atom had 3 electron domains, it's called trigonal planar. If it has 4 electron domains around it, it's called tetrahedral. 5 electron domains is trigonal bipyramidal. And if there are 6 electron domains, it's called octahedral. I'm going to go through them one by one. As you can see, there are bond angles associated with every shape, and so ultimately you'll want to know those also. All right, the next kind of introduction thing before we start going through the steps is to know the difference between electron domain geometry and what on the next slide I'll introduce is molecular geometry. The molecular geometry is what chemists are interested in. It's the geometry that the actual atoms make. But in order to figure that out, we first have to determine the electron domain geometry. So in a minute, you should understand the difference between those two. So let's say that we're looking at ammonia. You start out by drawing the Lewis structure of it. You count the electron domains. Ammonia has 1, 2, 3, 4 electron domains. If you look at the chart on the last slide, that means that it has a tetrahedral electron domain geometry. However, when you talk about molecular geometry, it's just the geometry the atoms make, and so although that lone pair of electrons determined the general shape that ammonia would take, you then essentially cover up any lone pairs and look at what's remaining to decide how you would describe the molecular geometry. And it turns out, as you'll see, we're going to go through more detail, but this is called a pyramidal geometry, molecular geometry. Again, we'll... Alright, so this kind of gives it to you a little bit more specifically. Electron domain geometry is tetrahedral, and molecular geometry, you would see that you ignore the non-bonding electrons, is trigonal pyramidal. Let's understand that terminology for now. Alright, so for each electron domain geometry that we go through, I will show you or describe the situation where all of the positions are occupied by atoms. So in this case, tetrahedral, all 4 of the electron domains are bonding atoms. And then you can take that same tetrahedral electron domain geometry, put 1 lone pair on it, and what's left is a shape we call trigonal pyramidal. Now you can also put 2 lone pairs on that central atom, and which leaves you only with 2 bonding atoms, and that is a bent structure. So I'll do this for each of the shapes as we go through. You can probably tell by now that, like I said, this is a pretty complex topic, so you may need to break it into pieces to listen to, but it's not something that you kick back and watch TV while you're listening to. Alright, so we're going to start at the beginning and try to go stepwise in good detail through each of the possible shapes. When there are only 2 electron domains around a central atom, for example here, BeCl2, it has to be linear. Okay, so these are 2 examples, beryllium dichloride, carbon dioxide. Anytime you have a central atom and you have 2 atoms or 2 domains attached to it, here's your central atom, 2 domains, it's going to be linear. The angle for linear, hopefully that's obvious to you, is 180 degrees. Alright, moving on up. If you have 3 electron domains, 1, 2, 3, the electron domain geometry is trigonal planar. Okay? And that's if you have all bonding atoms in all 3 possible electron domain positions. Now I want you to think for a minute, what if instead of one of the fluorines we had a lone pair? Then you would put your finger over the fluorine, pretend like nothing was there, and what shape would you have left? What would you call this shape where I'm drawing the black lines? That's a bent structure. Okay? So if you introduce lone pairs, you have a theme. So here it is summarized for you. If the number of electron domains is 3, the electron domain geometry is trigonal planar. If all 3 of the domains are bonding domains and there are no lone pairs or no non-bonding domains, then the molecular geometry is the same as the electron domain geometry, trigonal planar. However, if only 2 of the 3 domains are bonding and 1 of the domains is a non-bonding electron pair, then our shape is bent. Now, what is the bond angle with trigonal planar? All of these fluorine atoms are in the same plane. Okay, that's a position something would adopt if it has 3 things attached to it and they're trying to get as far away from each other as possible. So you can notice that makes a circle, and so each of the angles is 120 degrees. So that's the angle associated with trigonal planar shape. Alright, so here we go with 4 electron domains. Methane, CH4 is a perfect example of that. Okay, so if you have 4 areas around the central atom, then that is tetrahedral electron domain geometry. They are not all in the same plane. So I guess if you kind of think about having a tripod and then something sticking up straight from it, that's what a tetrahedral shape looks like. The bond angles are 109.5, which is a pretty weird angle. I guess you just have to memorize that. And you will need to know that for the test, the bond angles. Now, that's the electron domain geometry. That's also the molecular geometry if all four of the domains are bonding domains. However, what if we start introducing, instead of an atom, if we start introducing electron pairs? It's going to change the shape. So let's look at those. All right, so here's a tetrahedral electron domain, and where all four of the positions are occupied by atoms. That's still called tetrahedral. If we take one of the four positions and put a lone pair there, the shape we're looking at now is like this. Okay, that's called trigonal pyramidal. And if we have two sets of lone pairs in two out of those four domains, our shape is now bent. If we have three sets of non-bonding electrons in only one bonding domain, that's obviously linear. So when you get to tetrahedral, you have four different shapes that are possible depending on how many lone pairs you have. Okay, the next two are pretty tricky. We do 5 electron domains and 6 electron domains. They'll get pretty funky, so you may want to jot these down. All right, so when you have 5 areas of electron density, or 5 electron domains around a central atom, the electron domain geometry is called trigonal bipyramidal. This one is probably the trickiest one. Make note of how you draw it. You draw 3 of the domains coming out from the side or equatorial type position, and then one straight up and one straight down. One of the things that's odd about trigonal bipyramidal is that there are 2 different angles. The angles between the domains in the axial position and one of the equatorials is 90 degrees, and the bond angles between 2 of the equatorial positions are 120. Okay, so you have 2 different angles here. All right, so the ones that go straight up and down are called axial positions. The ones coming out of the equator are called equatorial positions. And so what if we start introducing, there go my dogs. If we start introducing non-bonding electrons in some of these positions, since the positions are different, equatorial and axial, where do you think we're going to put a non-bonding pair of electrons? Remember, electrons always want to be as far away from other electrons as they can get because of repulsion. So what position do you think you'd put a non-bonding pair of electrons in that would minimize repulsion? Well, you would put them in an equatorial position because they're 120 degrees away from any other electrons. If you were to put them in an axial position, they'd only be 90 degrees away from other electrons. And so you can potentially put up to 3 pairs of non-bonding electrons in the equatorial position. You could potentially end up with a linear shape, even if you started with 5 electron domains. So each of those now. All right, so we're talking about 5 electron domains. The electron domain geometry is trigonal bipyramidal. If all 5 of the domains are occupied with an atom, if they're all bonded, then it remains, the molecular geometry is called the same, trigonal bipyramidal. If we introduce one lone pair in one of those 5 positions, this is a really weird, it's called a seesaw. These equatorial, think of it as a stick figure, and these equatorial things are his arms. This guy's holding his arms out like to hug you. And then the straight up and down. Okay, so like seesaw. If you've ever been on a teeter-totter, kind of looks like that. And these are ones that you probably have to memorize. And if you introduce 2 lone pairs, in 2 out of the 5 positions, what you have left is the straight up and down, and then one straight out. That's T-shaped. And now if you introduce 3 non-bonding domains, 3 electron pairs, it occupies all 3 of the equatorial positions, and all you have left are straight up and down, a linear molecular shape. Okay, so since the trigonal bipyramidal system is so odd, I'm going to kind of go through each of the possible molecular shapes again. So if you have one non-bonding pair of electrons, one lone pair, it goes in the equatorial position, and then just put your finger over that whole non-bonding pair so that all you see is the straight up and down and then these 2 arms coming out at you. Okay? And so here's your molecular shape. You look to the far right here. And that is the seesaw molecular geometry. Onward. Oh, no, I remember what I was doing. Okay. So now if you introduce 2 non-bonding domains, or 2 lone pairs, and here's an example of that, bromine trifluoride, you end up with a T shape. Okay, and then here's an example where you have 5 domains, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 3 of those 5 domains are lone pairs. They all go in the equatorial position, and you actually end up, weirdly enough, with a linear shape. This is the last electron domain shape, and that is when you have 6 electron domains around the central atom. That's called octahedral electron domain geometry. All positions are equivalent, so the only electron domain shape that has unequivalent, is that a word? Positions are the trigonal bipyramidal. So the bond angle, all of the bond angles in the octahedral are 90 degrees. So as you can imagine, there are a bunch of possible shapes depending on how many lone pairs you have. So here they are. If all 6 of the electron domains are bonded atoms, of course its name is still octahedral. If we introduce 1 lone pair, all the positions are equivalent in octahedral, so it doesn't matter where you show the lone pair. What you end up with is something that's called square pyramid. Okay? And that's because I'm a horrible drawer. But if you were to draw, it would actually make a pyramid kind of if you connect the bonded atoms. So if you have 2 non-bonding domains, 2 lone pairs, you end up with square planar. All of the 4 remaining bonded atoms are all in one plane. So here's a little bit closer look up. Here's a square pyramid shape, and that's if you have just one. That's if you have just one lone pair. If you have 2 non-bonding lone pairs, it's just all in the same plane, square planar. Alright, so the hard part of the lecture is over, and now just a couple of tidbits to get a thorough understanding. And what I want you to know is that non-bonding electrons, lone pairs, I'm going to draw them in here, have a stronger repelling force than bonding electrons. So let's look at a tetrahedral where all 4 domains are bonding domains. They all have 4 atoms around it. The angle is 109.5. Now, if you look at ammonia, its electron domain geometry is still tetrahedral, okay, because it has 4 domains. But since one of the domains is a lone pair, the actual molecular geometry is pyramidal, trigonal pyramidal, pyramidal. Okay, now the bond angles are a little bit tighter than the 109.5. Why is that? That's because a lone pair of electrons has a stronger repelling force. Think of them as pushing down on the bonding electrons, and they squeeze in this angle so it's a little bit tighter. So if you look at water, again, it starts out with a tetrahedral electron domain geometry because it does have 4 areas, 4 domains, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the angles again start at 109.5, but because it has 2 lone pairs, they're pushing down extra strong on these bonding electrons, squeezing in this angle. So for water, that angle is about 104.5. So for every lone pair you introduce, it seems to decrease the bond angle by 2 to 3 degrees. That seems to be kind of the trend. Right? Multiple bonds, like this double bond, have stronger repelling power. That makes sense, right? A double bond has a total of 4 electrons in it. Triple has 6 electrons. So you literally just have more electrons there pushing. So what does that do? Because you have the stronger repulsion from the double bond, that means the angle in between the 2 atoms is tighter than you would expect. This is a trigonal planar shape, has 3 domains. The bonds are about 100, or the angles are about 120 degrees. And so what happens when you have multiple bond, the angle between the 2 single bond ones gets squeezed tighter than 120, and the angle in between the multiple bond and one of the singles gets larger than 120. So just as a summary, this might be a table that you print out and use as reference. It's on 2 pages. So again, if you have 2 areas around a central atom, it's linear. If you have 3 areas around a central atom, it can be trigonal planar or bent. I'm not going to go through them all again, but it's a really good chart. And there's page 2 of the chart. Alright, so what if you have a large molecule like this? The first thing I would ask myself is, what atom am I supposed to look at? You look at each central atom. You look at each atom that is not a terminal atom. So you would look at this carbon, and this oxygen. Everything else is terminal, so it doesn't make any sense to talk about its geometry. So a large molecule can have a certain geometry around one atom and a different geometry around another. So it may start out at bent at one end and trigonal bipyramidal on another end. So you take each of them individually. So for this particular molecule, if you look at this carbon first, it has 4 areas of electron density around it. So it is tetrahedral, and they're all atoms that it's bonded to. This particular carbon, the one in the middle, has 3 domains around it. 1, 2, 3. Trigonal planar, they are all atoms. And finally, you can talk about the shape around the oxygen. Oxygen has 1, 2, 3, 4 domains. So its electron domain geometry starts as tetrahedral, but since 2 of the electron domains are lone pairs, the molecular geometry of that oxygen is different. It is actually bent. Alright, so we're almost done. I do want you to understand a drawing convention so that you can understand 3-dimensional nature of molecules when you see them in a textbook. And I notice that Mastering Chemistry uses a drawing technique also. So let's say you're trying to draw CH4. And you know those 4 hydrogens are not in a plane. Hopefully you've listened to the lecture. And you know that it's a tetrahedral shape. So how do you draw CH4 in a three-dimensional way so that it looks like, that's what I think I told you, think of a tripod with a pole sticking straight up. How do you draw that? Well, one way to do that is what we call with wedges and hashes, hash marks. And so what you do for a tetrahedral is you put two of the hydrogens in the same plane, so just single lines, and then one of them goes, that this hash or dash line is going back into the board or the paper or whatever, and then when you see a wedge like this, it's coming out at you. Okay? So just so you know what that convention is if you see it. Oh yeah, much better. I forgot I had this. So if you were to make a molecular model of methane, CH4, it would look like this, and this is how chemists would represent it. That is it for this lecture. It takes a lot of practice to get good at this, so please make sure you practice a lot. You always have to draw a Lewis structure of a shape or of a molecule before you even try to draw the shape.